What if I told you that three of the most terrifying villains in horror history, Norman Bates, Leatherface, and Buffalo Bill, were all inspired by one man? This isn't a campfire story. It's not some myth whispered in the dark. This is the true story of Edward Gein, a man whose real-life crimes were far more horrifying than anything a screenwriter could ever dream up. Our story takes us deep into the desolate farmland of Plainfield, Wisconsin, to uncover the life of the man they called the Butcher of Plainfield. We'll walk through the quiet, poisoned childhood that created a monster. We'll sift through the evidence of his slide from a lonely mama's boy into a grave-robbing ghoul, and we'll stand at the threshold of his infamous house of horrors, a place so vile it would forever change the face of American horror. This isn't just a story about a killer. It's about the rotten seed of a disturbed mind and the terrifying cinematic monsters that grew from it. How could one quiet, unassuming handyman become the blueprint for so much on-screen terror? The truth is buried in the past, and we're about to dig it up. Stick with me as we uncover how his macabre creations and twisted mind gave birth to these iconic movie monsters. You think you know the villains, but you have no idea about the man who started it all. To understand the monster, you first have to understand the cage he was raised in. Plainfield, Wisconsin, in the early 20th century, was the picture of quiet American life. It was a small, isolated farming community of just a few hundred people, a place where everybody knew everybody else's business, or so they thought. The land was flat, the winters were brutal, and life revolved around hard work and church on Sunday. It was into this unassuming landscape that Edward Theodore Gein was born on August 27, 1906. From the outside, the Gein family might have seemed like any other, just struggling to get by. But inside their home, a quiet poison was seeping into the floorboards. The patriarch, George Gein, was a timid, alcoholic man who was a constant failure in his wife's eyes. He was a tanner and a carpenter who could never quite hold down a job. A ghost in his own home, who often retreated into a drunken stupor to escape the oppressive world his wife built. That world was created, in its entirety, by Augusta Rachel Gein. Augusta wasn't just a devout Lutheran. She was a fanatical tyrant who wielded her Bible like a weapon. In her eyes, the world outside their farm was a cesspool of sin and moral decay. She believed all men were vessels of lust, and that all women, with the single glaring exception of herself, were agents of the devil, sent to lead men astray. This wasn't just a belief, it was the gospel she preached daily to her two young sons, Henry, the elder, and little Ed. Desperate to shield her boys from the world's contamination, Augusta convinced George to leave the city of La Crosse. In 1914, they bought a secluded 160-acre farm on the outskirts of Plainfield. This farm wasn't a home, it was a prison. The isolation was deliberate and absolute. Augusta forbade her sons from having friends. They left the farm only for school and had to return immediately. Any attempt to socialize was met with harsh punishment and fiery sermons about the sins of the flesh. Inside this pressure cooker, the two brothers coped in very different ways. Henry, the older brother, started to develop a quiet defiance. He saw through his mother's hypocrisy and sometimes dared to challenge her. He worried constantly about his younger brother's strange and total devotion to Augusta, seeing the unhealthy bond for what it was. Ed, though, was different. He was a shy, awkward boy with a strange, high-pitched laugh that made him a target for bullies. He had no friends, no social life, no escape. His entire world was his mother. He soaked up her teachings without question, clinging to her every word. He found comfort in her terrifying worldview, because it was the only one he knew. He worshipped her. To Ed, she wasn't a tyrant, she was a saint. the only source of goodness in a world teeming with evil. This bond, forged in isolation and fear, was the root of all the horror to come. He was being groomed, not for life, but for a singular, obsessive devotion that would leave him utterly broken when his anchor was finally cut away. The quiet farm in Plainfield wasn't just a home, it was a laboratory for creating a monster, and Edward Gein was its chief architect. The fragile, toxic world of the Gein farm was always going to collapse. The first pillar fell on April 1st, 1940, when George Gein died of heart failure at the age of 66. For the family, his death was hardly a tragedy. For Augusta, it was one less sinner under her roof. For Ed and Henry, it meant they were now alone with their mother, her influence more concentrated than ever. They kept working the farm, two grown men, still living under the thumb of a mother who treated them like little boys. But Henry, now in his early 40s, was growing bolder. He started to openly talk back to Augusta, criticizing her domineering ways. He was especially worried about Ed, whose attachment to their mother had become unnervingly intense. He saw his brother, a man nearing middle age, still behaving like a frightened child. Henry began making plans to escape, and had even started dating a divorced single mother, an act that would have been the ultimate sin in Augusta's eyes. Then, on May 16, 1944, a fire broke out. A marsh fire had started on the Gein property, and the brothers went out to fight it. As the day wore on, Ed went to the police with a strange story. He said he and Henry had gotten separated in the smoke, and now he couldn't find him. He seemed disoriented, yet when a search party was organized, Ed was able to lead them directly to his brother's body. Henry was lying face down, dead, but he wasn't burned. The official cause of death was listed as asphyxiation from the smoke, but there were whispers, details that didn't make the official report. The ground around Henry's body was untouched by the fire, and some said he had bruises on his head. In a small town where things like this were almost unheard of, the local coroner quickly ruled the death an accident. No autopsy, no investigation. Looking back, you have to ask the question, was this Ed's first kill? Was Henry's defiance a threat to Ed's cloistered world? Was it a desperate act to keep the only family he knew intact? We'll never know for sure, but with Henry gone, Ed was now exactly where Augusta wanted him, alone with her, his devotion undivided. The victory, if you can call it that, didn't last. Not long after Henry's death, Augusta suffered a massive stroke that left her partially paralyzed. For the next year, Ed became her sole caretaker. He tended to her every need, spoon-feeding her, reading her the Bible, and listening to her endless rants against the sinful world. Their roles were now set in stone. He was the devoted servant, and she was his helpless holy charge. Then, on December 29, 1945, Augusta suffered a second fatal stroke. Edward Gein, at 39 years old, was now completely, utterly alone. His reaction wasn't just grief. It was a catastrophic psychological collapse. His entire universe, the woman who was his mother, his God, and his only companion, was gone. The farmhouse fell silent, the sermons stopped, and in that terrifying silence, something in Ed Gein's mind began to snap, giving way to the darkness that had been growing inside him for decades. The monster was about to be born. With Augusta gone, the Gein farm became a tomb. Ed was a ghost haunting his own life. A man totally unmoored from reality. He took on odd jobs around Plainfield, working as a handyman and even babysitting for neighbors, who all saw him as a harmless, if eccentric, loner. They had no idea what was happening behind the closed doors of that farmhouse. The first thing he did was seal off his mother's world. He boarded up her bedroom, the parlor, and the living room, preserving them exactly as they were when she was alive. They became untouched shrines. The rest of the house, however, began to decay. Mirroring the decay in his own mind, it descended into an unbelievable squalor of filth and garbage. In this isolation, Ed's mind went to dark places. He became a voracious reader, but not of novels or the news. He devoured pulp horror magazines, adventure stories, and grisly accounts of Nazi atrocities. He was fascinated by human anatomy. The very thing his mother had taught him was the source of all sin. This morbid curiosity started to merge with his crushing grief. He missed his mother. He missed her so much that he began to fantasize about ways to be with her again, to understand the female form she had so furiously condemned. He wanted what was buried in the ground, and so his nightly trips began. He started scanning the obituaries in the local newspapers, looking for recently deceased middle-aged women. Women who in his mind resembled his mother. It was always about Augusta. He wasn't just looking for any corpse. He was looking for a replacement. Under the cover of darkness, he would drive to local cemeteries. He later claimed he was often in a daze-like state during these trips, and would sometimes snap out of it and leave. But on at least 9 confirmed occasions, he didn't leave empty-handed. He dug into the fresh earth and pulled the bodies of these women from their graves. He wasn't a necrophile. He told police the bodies were too smelly for sexual acts. His goal was something far stranger. He wanted to possess them. He would take the bodies back to his farm, and there, in his shed, he would begin his work. He skinned the corpses, tanning the skin like an animal hide. His motivation, he later claimed, was a twisted, desperate desire to bring his mother back. He told investigators he wanted to create a woman's suit from the skin of these corpses, so that he could literally crawl into her skin and become her. It was a delusional attempt to reverse death, to beat his loneliness by embodying the only person he had ever loved. He wasn't just robbing graves. He was harvesting parts for a monstrous art project, a grotesque attempt to build a new mother from the pieces of the dead. Right here, in this period of grave robbing and morbid crafting, a powerful cinematic idea was born. The image of a lone man, working late into the night in a secluded farmhouse, surrounded by the remnants of the dead, is pure American Gothic horror. He wasn't just a killer, he was a creator, a sort of real-life Dr. Frankenstein, but his creations weren't meant to be brought to life. They were objects of death, designed to be worn and used. This idea of a killer who is also a craftsman, a butcher who is also an artist, is a deeply unsettling concept that has echoed through horror cinema ever since. Before Gein, the mad scientist was a figure of fiction, but here was a real man, not a scientist but a simple farmer, engaging in a similar kind of macabre work. He was transforming the sacred, the human body, into the profane furniture, clothing, and masks. This act of turning people into objects is the ultimate dehumanization. It laid the groundwork for future movie villains who don't just kill their victims, but use them, consume them, or make them part of their twisted homes. Gein's real life proved that the most grotesque ideas imaginable weren't confined to fiction. They were happening in the heart of quiet, unassuming America. On the evening of November 16, 1957, the world finally discovered what was festering inside Ed Gein's farmhouse. It all started with the disappearance of a local hardware store owner, a woman named Bernice Worden. The last customer in her store that day was Ed Gein, who had come in to buy a gallon of antifreeze. When Sheriff Art Schlee arrived at Gein's farm, he had no idea he was about to step into a real-life nightmare, one that would make the most depraved horror novels seem tame. The house was a wreck, a maze of junk and filth, but it was the smell that hit them first, the foul, sickly, sweet odor of decay. They made their way through the cluttered kitchen and into a woodshed. There, in the beam of their flashlights, they saw it. Hanging upside down from a meat hook was the naked, headless body of a woman. It had been dressed out like a deer. It was Bernice Worden. This was only the beginning. As hardened investigators began to search the property, they uncovered a collection of horrors that defied belief. The scene was so profoundly disturbing that Sheriff Schley would die of heart failure just a month later at the age of 43. Many believed he never truly recovered from what he saw inside that house. Let's walk through what they found, because it's in these details that the inspiration for future movie monsters becomes chillingly clear. In the kitchen, they found soup bowls crafted from the top halves of human skulls. In the house, they found chairs with seats upholstered not with fabric, but with tanned human skin. On his bedposts, they found more skulls, mounted like grotesque trophies. In a shoebox, they discovered a collection of 9 preserved female vulvas, painted and kept like trinkets. They found a corset made from a female torso, skinned from the shoulders to the waist. They found leggings fashioned from the skin of human legs. They found a belt made from human nipples. The pull cord on a window shade was a pair of human lips, and hanging on a wall, they found what looked like masks. But they weren't rubber. They were the actual faces of dead women, peeled from the skull and preserved. In a paper bag, they found the face of Mary Hogan, a tavern owner who had disappeared 3 years earlier. In a box, they found her skull, and in a sack, they found the head of Bernice Worden. Her heart was in a plastic bag on the stove. But the centerpiece of this collection, the item that spoke most directly to Gein's psychology, was the woman's suit. This was a full torso, complete with breasts, flayed from a corpse and tanned, which Gein would wear. He would put on the skin of a woman, pull on one of the face masks, and dance around his filthy farmhouse, lost in his delusion of becoming his mother. It's impossible to overstate the impact these discoveries had. When the news broke, the details of Gein's House of Horrors were splashed across newspapers nationwide, providing a wellspring of unimaginable horror for a new generation of filmmakers. Leatherface. Let's start with 1974's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The film's creators, Tobe Hooper and Kim Henkel, have openly said they drew heavily from the Gein case. Leatherface, the film's silent killer, isn't just a murderer. He's a craftsman of the macabre, just like Gein. The most obvious parallel is the mask stitched together from the skin of his victims, a direct echo of the face masks found in Gein's home. But it goes deeper. The Sawyer family home in the film is a cinematic reflection of Gein's farmhouse, a place decorated with human remains, from the bone furniture to the general atmosphere of decay. Gein provided the terrifyingly real blueprint for a family of killers who didn't just murder people, but used them as raw materials. Buffalo Bill. Now, let's jump to 1991 and The Silence of the Lambs. The film's killer, James Gum, also known as Buffalo Bill, is a composite of several real-life serial killers, but his defining, most disturbing trait comes directly from Ed Gein. Gum kidnaps and kills women for a single horrifying purpose: to skin them so he can create a woman's suit for himself. This is the exact same motivation Gein confessed to. The scene where Gum dances in front of a mirror, wearing the scalp and skin of a victim, is a direct dramatization of what Gein described doing. Author Thomas Harris tapped into the same psychological horror, the desire to transform by literally cloaking oneself in the skin of another. Gum's project is pure Ed Gein. These two villains owe their most terrifying traits to the horrors uncovered in that Wisconsin farmhouse. Gein proved that truth could be infinitely more disturbing than fiction. The horrifying collection in Gein's farmhouse was built mostly from the bodies he exhumed. For years, that was enough. But eventually, grave robbing became too difficult. Or perhaps the materials he was getting weren't fresh enough for his projects. At some point, the line between robbing the dead and creating the dead blurred, and Ed Gein crossed it. While he was suspected in other disappearances, he only confessed to 2 murders. The first was Mary Hogan, the 51-year-old owner of a local tavern. On December 8, 1954, she vanished. A customer found a pool of blood on the floor and a spent cartridge case. The investigation went nowhere. Mary was just gone. Gein, a patron at the tavern, was questioned briefly but dismissed. He was just harmless Eddie. In reality, he had shot Mary in the head and taken her body back to his farm on a sled. For 3 years, he kept this secret, living quietly among the people who wondered what had happened to her. His second and final victim was Bernice Warden, the 58-year-old owner of the Plainfield hardware store. On November 16, 1957, she too disappeared. Her son Frank was the town's deputy sheriff. He entered the store to find the cash register open and a trail of blood. Looking at the day's sales slips, he found the last one, a receipt for a gallon of antifreeze, made out to Ed Gein. Frank had always been suspicious of Gein and told the sheriff. That receipt was the crucial link that finally led law enforcement to the isolated farmhouse. They went there to question Gein about a missing person and instead found Bernice Warden's butchered corpse. Gein's motive for murder was chillingly practical. When the supply from cemeteries wasn't meeting his demand, he turned to living sources. His choice of victims wasn't random. Both Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden were middle-aged women who, in his warped mind, resembled his mother. The murders were just a more direct way of continuing his obsessive, posthumous relationship with Augusta. He was no longer just collecting surrogates, he was creating them. When the police finally arrested Ed Gein, they found a calm, compliant, almost childlike man. He readily confessed to the murders of Mary Hogan and Bernice Warden. He spoke about the horrors in his home with a strange detachment, as if he were describing a hobby, like collecting stamps. The world wanted to know what could create such a man. Initially, in 1957, Gein was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, he was sent to the Central State Hospital for the Criminally Insane. It was during these evaluations that the deepest psychological parallel in horror history came into focus. This is the big one. While Leatherface and Buffalo Bill borrowed Gein's gruesome hobbies, Norman Bates, the iconic villain of Robert Bloch's 1959 novel Psycho and Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film, inherited his soul. Robert Bloch was living just 35 miles from Plainfield when the Gein story broke. He was fascinated by the case, not just the gore, but the psychology of a man so dominated by his mother that he couldn't let her go, even in death. From that, Norman Bates was born. The parallels are striking. First, the overpowering mother. Both the fictional Norma Bates and the real Augusta Gein were fanatics who taught their sons that sex was a sin and all other women were whores. This created a profound conflict in both men, a mix of desire for and terror of women. Second, the preservation of the mother. Norman Bates famously keeps his mother's mummified corpse in the cellar. Gein didn't exhume his own mother, but he did the next best thing. He sealed off her rooms, turning them into untouched shrines. In both cases, the mother's presence was preserved as sacred. Third, and most importantly, adopting the mother's persona. This is the core of Psycho. Norman develops a split personality, becoming his mother to kill women he finds attractive. Gein didn't have a diagnosed split personality, but his motivation was hauntingly similar. His woman suit was a physical manifestation of the same psychological need to merge with and become the lost maternal figure. He was trying to bring her back by embodying her. This is the psychological root of Norman Bates. Bloch took the raw facts of Gein's life, the isolation, the maternal obsession, the violence, and distilled them into one of the most terrifying characters in fiction. When Hitchcock brought Psycho to the screen, he cemented the Gein-inspired archetype in the public consciousness forever. If you found this deep dive into the real-life horror behind cinema's greatest monsters fascinating, do us a favor and hit that like button and subscribe for more true crime stories. It really helps us continue to unearth these incredible and often terrifying histories. Let us know in the comments which horror icon's origin story you want us to explore next. Ed Gein spent 10 years at the mental hospital before doctors decided he was sane enough to stand trial. In 1968, the trial was held. For practical reasons, mainly the cost to the state, he was tried only for the murder of Bernice Worden. He was found guilty, but also found not guilty by reason of insanity. He was sent back to a state mental institution where he would spend the rest of his life. By all accounts, he was a model patient, quiet, polite, and no trouble at all. The house of horrors on his farm had mysteriously burned to the ground in 1958, likely the work of arson, erasing the physical evidence of his crimes, but not the memory. Ed Gein died of respiratory failure on July 26, 1984, at the age of 77. He was buried in the Plainfield Cemetery, in the family plot, just a few feet away from his mother, Augusta, and the women whose graves he once violated. The story of Ed Gein is a chilling reminder that the most enduring monsters aren't born of fantasy, they're human. He was a man warped by isolation, abuse, and mental illness, whose personal hell was so grotesque that it overflowed into our collective nightmares. This quiet man from the middle of nowhere didn't just commit murder, he created a new language of horror. Without him, the shower scene in Psycho might never have terrified a generation. The sound of a chainsaw in Texas might not have carried the same weight, and the silence of the lambs might have been broken by a different kind of villain. He was the butcher of Plainfield, a real-life American horror story, and his legacy is a blood-soaked stain on our darkest fears.